The evening sun cast long shadows through the elegant windows of Le Petit Bistro, where soft jazz music mingled with the gentle clinking of fine china and crystal glasses. Lynn had just started her evening shift, adjusting her crisp black apron, while watching the usual crowd of well-dressed patrons filing in through the ornate entrance doors. This wasn't just another upscale French restaurant, it was a place where live piano music filled the air every evening, where wealthy executives closed million-dollar deals over perfectly cooked steaks, and where Lynn had learned to smile through even the toughest situations. She'd been working here for 8 months now, though none of her co-workers knew the full story of how she'd ended up serving tables at Le Petit Bistro. In her locker, carefully tucked away in a worn leather folder, sat 2 master's degrees from Juilliard, prestigious awards that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Lynn remembered the standing ovations, the newspaper reviews praising her extraordinary talent and profound musical sensitivity. But life had other plans, as it often does. "Table 7 needs more water," called out Rob, her fellow server, as he rushed past with a tray full of appetizers. Lynn nodded, quickly filling a crystal pitcher. She moved through the restaurant with practiced grace, weaving between tables while maintaining perfect posture, a habit from her performing days that she couldn't shake. The restaurant's signature scent of fresh-baked bread and herbs reminded her of the music school she'd dreamed of opening. Every tip she earned went into a special savings account, slowly growing toward that goal. But for now, her mother's medical bills took priority. After her mom's stroke last year, Lynn had put her music career on hold without hesitation. Family came first. That's what her mother had always taught her. "How's your mom doing?" asked Mrs. Thompson, one of her regular customers, as Lynn refilled her water glass. The elderly woman always requested Lynn's section and left generous tips, often sharing stories about her own children who rarely visited. "She's making progress," Lynn replied warmly, genuine appreciation showing in her smile. "She managed to walk up the stairs by herself yesterday." These little conversations kept her going, reminders that even in this temporary role, she was making genuine connections. Between serving courses, Lynn would sometimes catch herself mentally playing along with the restaurant's pianist, her fingers twitching slightly as they remembered the feel of ivory keys beneath them. The evening crowd was starting to build, and Lynn could see the host seating more parties. The restaurant's pianist, Mr. Lee, was setting up for his nightly performance, arranging his sheet music with careful precision. He was in his 70s but played with the enthusiasm of someone half his age. Sometimes, during quiet afternoons, he'd let Lynn practice on the baby grand piano, recognizing a fellow musician's soul beneath her server's uniform. "Big party coming in," warned Katie, another server, as she hurried past. "Some big-shot real estate guy and his friends. Watch out, I've heard he's a real piece of work." Lynn straightened her name tag and took a deep breath. She'd handled difficult customers before. After all, performing Rachmaninoff in front of thousands wasn't so different from serving demanding patrons. Both required patience, skill, and an ability to stay composed under pressure. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing delicious aromas of garlic and butter. Chef Pierre's voice rang out, calling orders in his distinctive French-American accent. Lynn loved how the kitchen operated like an orchestra, each person playing their part, creating something beautiful together. As she arranged fresh silverware on a newly cleared table, Lynn caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished windows. She saw both versions of herself, the accomplished musician and the dedicated daughter who put her family first. Neither role diminished the other, they were just different movements in the symphony of her life. The sun had fully set now, and the restaurant's crystal chandeliers cast a warm, intimate glow across the dining room. Another busy evening was unfolding, and Lynn had no idea that in just a few hours, her 2 worlds would collide in an unexpected way that would change everything. Through the front windows, she could see several luxury cars pulling up to the valet station. The big party Katie had mentioned was arriving. Lynn squared her shoulders and reminded herself that every role deserved to be played with dignity, whether on a concert stage or in a restaurant dining room. What she didn't know was that this particular evening would test not just her patience and professionalism, but would ultimately lead to an opportunity to prove that true talent and grace can shine through in the most unexpected moments. The front doors of Le Petit Bistro swung open precisely at 7:30 p.m., letting in a burst of cool evening air along with a group that immediately commanded attention. Leading the pack was a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lynn's monthly rent. His perfectly polished shoes clicked against the hardwood floors as he strode in like he owned the place. "I specifically requested the corner table by the window," he announced loudly before the host could even greet him. His voice carried across the restaurant, causing several diners to look up from their meals. The host, a young man named Tony who'd started just last week, fumbled with his reservation book. I apologize, sir, but that table is currently occupied by—" "Do you have any idea who I am?" The man cut him off, adjusting his gold cufflinks with practiced flair. "I'm Mr. Brooks, and I own half the buildings in this city's financial district. That table has been my regular spot for years." Behind him, his group of 6 equally well-dressed associates shifted uncomfortably. One woman in a red dress touched his arm gently, as if trying to calm him, but he shrugged her off. Lynn watched from nearby while pretending to arrange wine glasses, her heart going out to Tony, whose face had turned bright red. The restaurant manager quickly appeared, smoothly intervening. "Mr. Brooks, welcome back. We'll have your preferred table ready in just a few moments. Perhaps you and your guests would enjoy complimentary champagne at our bar while you wait." Mr. Brooks made a show of checking his watch, a timepiece that gleamed under the chandelier lights. 5 minutes, he declared, not a second more. Lynn's section included the bar area, which meant she would be serving them. Taking a deep breath, she approached with her most professional smile. "Good evening, I'm Lynn, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you off with our house champagne?" Mr. Brooks barely glanced at her. "House champagne? Do I look like someone who drinks house anything?" He turned to his companions with a smirk. "Bring us a bottle of crystal. At least $2,000 a bottle, nothing less." "Excellent choice, sir," Lynn replied, maintaining her composure. "Would you like to see our wine list for dinner as well?" He finally looked at her properly, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly would you know about fine wine? I suppose next you'll be telling me you're a sommelier too." His friends chuckled dutifully at his sarcasm. Lynn had actually taken several wine appreciation courses during her time at Juilliard. Many classical musicians did, given how often they attended upscale events. But she simply smiled and said, "Our sommelier would be happy to assist you with your selection when you're ready." As she walked away to get their champagne, she could hear Mr. Brooks loudly telling his companions about a recent yacht purchase. The other customers in the bar area had grown quiet, some shooting sympathetic glances her way. When their table was ready, the group moved from the bar, leaving their champagne glasses in disarray. As Lynn cleared them, she noticed Mr. Brooks hadn't left a tip, not that she'd expected one. Some of the stems had finger smudges all over them, as if they'd been deliberately handled to create extra work. Throughout the evening, Mr. Brooks seemed determined to find fault with everything. The bread wasn't warm enough. The butter was too cold. The lighting was too bright, then too dim. With each complaint, his voice grew louder, as if he wanted everyone in the restaurant to witness his importance. "You call this a proper wine pour?" he scoffed when Lynn served their first bottle of wine. "Didn't they teach you anything in waitress school?" His companions tittered, though Lynn noticed a few of them looked embarrassed. She adjusted the pour slightly, remembering her old piano teacher's words about grace under pressure. "My apologies, sir. Is this more to your liking?" "I suppose it'll have to do," he sighed dramatically. "Though I'm beginning to wonder about the standards of this establishment. In my restaurants, we only hire people who understand true quality." Lynn continued her other table's service with extra attention, grateful for the regular customers who smiled encouragingly at her. Mrs. Thompson, still at her table, caught her eye and shook her head in disapproval at Mr. Brooks's behavior. The evening was far from over, and Lynn could feel a tension headache building behind her eyes. But she held on to her dignity, remembering all the times she performed difficult pieces on stage. This was just another performance, another challenge to overcome with grace. What she didn't know was that Mr. Brooks's worst behavior was yet to come, and that the evening would take an unexpected turn that would leave everyone in the restaurant speechless, including the arrogant man who thought he owned the world. The evening at Le Petit Bistro was in full swing when the manager's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. Mr. Lee, their regular pianist who had been playing at the restaurant for over 15 years, wasn't feeling well. He apologized profusely but said he couldn't make it in. His hands were shaking too badly to perform. The timing couldn't have been worse. The dining room was packed, and the gentle piano music that usually filled the air was noticeably absent. Regular customers kept glancing at the empty piano bench, their conversations punctuated by uncomfortable silences where musical notes should have been. At Mr. Brooks's table, things were getting increasingly tense. He'd already sent back 2 perfectly cooked steaks, claiming they weren't prepared to his liking. The kitchen staff was doing their best, but his complaints seemed endless. Chef Pierre, usually calm and collected, was starting to show signs of stress, his face reddening as he prepared a 3rd steak. First, they give us a waitress who doesn't understand proper service, Mr. Brooks announced loudly to his table, not bothering to lower his voice as Lynn passed by with a tray of desserts for another table. And now we don't even get the entertainment this place supposedly prides itself on. Lynn carefully set down her desserts, making sure each plate was perfectly positioned. She could feel her hands wanting to shake but kept them steady, just as she used to do before major performances. A couple at the next table gave her understanding smiles. They'd been watching Mr. Brooks's behavior all evening with growing disapproval. The restaurant manager approached Mr. Brooks's table, his expression apologetic. "Sir, I deeply regret that our pianist is unwell tonight. We'd be happy to offer your entire party complimentary desserts to make up for any disappointment." Mr. Brooks leaned back in his chair, adjusting his expensive tie with one hand. "Complimentary desserts? Do you think I came here for free cake?" He gestured around the room with his wine glass, nearly spilling the red liquid. "I brought important clients here tonight, promising them the full experience. Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" His voice had risen even further, and now almost every diner in the restaurant was watching the scene unfold. One of his companions, a quiet man in glasses who hadn't said much all evening, seemed to sink lower in his chair. "Perhaps," Mr. Brooks continued, standing up to his full height, "I should show everyone here what real entertainment looks like." He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "I have musicians on speed dial who would put your regular pianist to shame. Real artists, not some local amateur." Lynn, who was clearing plates from a nearby table, knew Mr. Lee was far from amateur. He'd played at Carnegie Hall multiple times during his prime. But she kept quiet, continuing her work with practiced efficiency. In fact, Mr. Brooks declared, his voice dripping with condescension, "I bet anyone in this room could do better than whatever second-rate entertainment you usually provide. Hey," he snapped his fingers at Lynn, who was still clearing tables. "You there, can you play anything besides the radio?" A few gasps echoed through the dining room at his rudeness. Mrs. Thompson, still at her table, looked ready to say something, but Lynn caught her eye and gave a small shake of her head. This wasn't the time, not yet. The manager stepped forward again, his face a mix of embarrassment and concern. "Mr. Brooks, please, we understand your disappointment, but..." "But what?" Mr. Brooks cut him off. "You're charging full price for half the experience. I'd love to see anyone from your serving class provide suitable entertainment." He practically spat the words. "I'll even make it interesting. $10,000 to any server who can play something more complicated than chopsticks on that piano." His companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman in the red dress who had tried to calm him earlier was now staring intently at her plate. The quiet man with glasses had pulled out his own phone, presumably trying to disappear into it. In the kitchen, Lynn could hear plates clattering as staff tried to continue their work despite the tension. Chef Pierre was muttering in French, probably counting to 10 as he often did when stressed. The other servers had gathered near the kitchen doors, watching with a mixture of anger and helplessness. Lynn felt something shift inside her as she placed the last dirty plate in her tray. She thought about her mother, who always told her that true strength wasn't about showing off or putting others down. It was about knowing when to stand up for what's right. She thought about all her years of training, the countless hours of practice, the joy of music that had been part of her life for so long. The restaurant had grown eerily quiet. Even the usual kitchen noise seemed muted, as if the whole place was holding its breath. Mr. Brooks stood there, a smug smile on his face, clearly believing he'd made his point about the staff's inadequacy. He had no idea that his challenge was about to change the entire evening in ways he never could have anticipated. Time seemed to slow down in Le Petit Bistro as Mr. Brooks's challenge hung in the air. Lynn stood by the kitchen doors, her hand resting on the smooth wooden frame, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant. The dining room had fallen so quiet that she could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning above. Her mind drifted to the small apartment where her mother was probably sitting in her favorite chair, doing her evening physical therapy exercises. They'd talked just that morning about dignity, about how it wasn't something others could take from you, but something you had to choose to maintain. "What's the matter?" Mr. Brooks's voice cut through her thoughts. He was still standing, his expensive suit catching the light from the chandeliers. "Too scared to take up my challenge." "I thought so." He turned to his companions with a triumphant smirk. "See what I mean about the quality of help these days?" Behind Lynn, she could hear Chef Pierre muttering under his breath. Tony, the young host, was gripping his reservation book so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Another server, Beth, who had been nothing but kind to Lynn since her first day, looked ready to throw her serving tray at Mr. Brooks's head. Lynn thought about her morning routine, how she'd wake up early to help her mother with breakfast before heading to the restaurant, how she'd practice piano on a small electronic keyboard during her lunch breaks, her fingers never forgetting the feel of the keys despite months away from proper performance. She remembered her last concert at Juilliard, the standing ovation, the flowers, the critics calling her a rising star in the classical music world. But more importantly, she remembered what her mother had said that night. Music isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about sharing something beautiful with the world. The restaurant manager was trying to salvage the situation, offering Mr. Brooks's table a complimentary bottle of their finest wine. But Mr. Brooks wasn't finished. He pulled out his wallet and made a show of counting out crisp $100 bills. "Let me make this more interesting," he announced, his voice carrying across the restaurant. $15,000 to any server who can play something worthy of my time. Come on, surely one of you has some hidden talent. He laughed, and a few of his companions joined in nervously. Mrs. Thompson, still at her table, caught Lynn's eye again. This time, her look wasn't just sympathetic, it was encouraging. She gave Lynn a small nod, as if to say, "Show him what you can do." Lynn felt her phone buzz in her apron pocket, probably a text from her mother sending her usual evening encouragement. Her mom always seemed to know exactly when she needed support, even from miles away. She thought about all the reasons she'd been keeping her musical background quiet, the desire to avoid attention, the focus on saving money for her mother's treatment, the simple dignity of doing honest work without explanation or excuse. But maybe there was something more important than staying in the shadows. A memory surfaced of her mother's words from years ago, when Lynn had been nervous before a major competition. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply show who you really are." The other servers were still watching, their faces a mix of anger and helplessness at Mr. Brooks's behavior. Lynn had seen some of them stay late to help others finish their shifts, share tips when someone was struggling, cover for each other when family emergencies came up. They weren't just colleagues. They were good people who deserved better than being looked down upon. Lynn's hands, which had served countless dishes over the past months, suddenly itched for the feel of piano keys. She thought about Mr. Lee, the regular pianist who had always treated her with respect, who had recognized something in her, even though she'd never told him about her background. The beautiful grand piano sat silent in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the warm restaurant lights. It was a magnificent instrument. Lynn had secretly admired it every day since she started working here. She knew its touch, having practiced on it during quiet afternoons when Mr. Lee would generously step aside. Mr. Brooks was still standing, still smirking, still certain of his superiority. His challenge wasn't really about music. It was about power, about putting people in their place, about reinforcing the walls he built between himself and those he considered beneath him. Lynn took a deep breath, remembering all the performances she'd given, all the hours of practice, all the moments of doubt and triumph. She thought about her mother's courage in facing her illness, about the dignity of every person in this restaurant who worked hard to create beautiful experiences for others. Slowly, deliberately, she untied her apron. The simple act felt momentous, like stepping through a door that couldn't be closed again. She folded the apron carefully, the way her mother had taught her to fold everything, and placed it on a nearby service station. The restaurant held its collective breath, sensing that something was about to happen. Even Mr. Brooks's smug expression flickered slightly as he watched her movements. Lynn had made her decision. It wasn't about the money, or about proving anything to a rude customer. It was about music, about truth, about standing up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. She took one step toward the piano, then another. It was time to show that true class had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with how you treat others. The walk to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. Lynn could feel every step, hear every soft footfall on the hardwood floor. The dining room had fallen into complete silence. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, peering through the service doors to watch what was about to unfold. Mr. Brooks's smirk grew wider as she approached the piano. Well, he drawled, looks like someone wants to earn a little extra tip money. A few of his companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. Lynn didn't respond. Instead, she gently lifted the piano's glossy black lid, revealing the pristine keys beneath. She adjusted the bench with the practiced movement of someone who had done this countless times before. The familiar motion brought back a flood of memories, concert halls, recitals, years of dedication. She sat down, taking a moment to center herself. The piano bench felt like home. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she closed her eyes briefly, remembering her mother's words from so many performances. Just breathe and let the music speak. Without announcement or flourish, Lynn began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant, soft at first, like raindrops before a storm. Her fingers moved with certainty, finding each key without hesitation. The gentle beginning slowly built, growing in complexity and power. Mr. Brooks's smug expression froze on his face. This wasn't chopsticks or a simple tune. This was one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, and Lynn was playing it as if she'd been born to do just this. The music swelled, filling every corner of the restaurant. Diners set down their forks, wine glasses remained untouched, conversations died mid-sentence. The piece was known for its technical difficulty, but in Lynn's hands, it became something more. A story of passion, of hidden depths, of triumph over adversity. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out both thunder and whispers from the instrument. Years of training showed in every movement, every perfectly timed phrase. The restaurant's grand piano, which had seen countless performances, seemed to come alive under her touch. In the kitchen doorway, Chef Pierre stood with tears in his eyes, his earlier frustration forgotten. Mrs. Thompson sat with her hands clasped, a proud smile on her face. The other servers watched in amazement, seeing their colleague in an entirely new light. The piece built to one of its most challenging sections, a passage that had challenged pianists for generations. Lynn attacked it fearlessly, her hands flowing across the keys with impossible grace. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, each one crystal clear and perfectly placed. Mr. Brooks had sunk back into his chair, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. The woman in the red dress was openly crying, moved by the beauty of the performance. The quiet man with glasses had put down his phone and was watching with genuine wonder. Lynn lost herself in the music, just as she had done countless times before. The restaurant disappeared, the audience faded away, and there was only the pure joy of creation. Her whole body moved with the rhythm, feeling every note, every phrase, every moment of emotion built into the piece. Other diners had tears in their eyes. An elderly couple held hands across their table, swaying gently to the music. A young girl at a family dinner sat transfixed, watching Lynn's hands with wide-eyed wonder. The piece reached its powerful climax, Lynn's fingers drawing forth a storm of sound from the piano. The music filled the space completely, transforming the simple restaurant into a concert hall. Even the chandeliers seemed to sparkle more brightly, as if responding to the waves of music. Through it all, Lynn maintained perfect control, perfect poise. This wasn't just a performance, it was a statement about dignity, about the hidden depths that exist in every person, about the foolishness of judging others based on their current circumstances. As she approached the final section, Lynn thought of her mother, of their small apartment, of the dreams they still shared. She poured all of that into the music, the love, the struggle, the unwavering hope. The final note sprang out, clear and true, hanging in the air like stars. Then silence. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The last notes faded away, leaving an almost electric stillness in their wake, and then the restaurant erupted. The applause started with Mrs. Thompson and spread like wildfire. People stood up from their tables, clapping and cheering. The kitchen staff burst into thunderous applause, Chef Pierre wiping his eyes with his apron. Someone shouted "Bravo" from the back of the room. Lynn stood and gave a small, graceful bow, the kind she'd done hundreds of times before. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She had done what she came to do, not for the money or the recognition, but for something far more important. The standing ovation continued, growing louder. Strangers were smiling at each other, united in their awe. The young girl who had watched so intently was jumping up and down, tugging at her mother's sleeve and pointing at the piano. And Mr. Brooks? He sat in his expensive suit in his requested table, completely forgotten by everyone in the room. All eyes were on the waitress who had just proved that true class, true talent, and true worth had nothing to do with the size of your wallet or the price of your clothes. Lynn straightened her server's uniform and smoothed back her hair. The applause was still going strong, but she could see tables that needed clearing and orders that needed taking. There was work to be done. But something had changed in the restaurant, something fundamental and irreversible. And it wasn't just about a surprising piano performance. It was about challenging assumptions, about the dignity of work, about the countless stories that lie behind every person we meet. The evening was far from over, and Lynn knew there would be more surprises to come. But for now, she had reminded everyone in that dining room of an essential truth, that beauty, talent, and grace can appear in the most unexpected places, if only we have the wisdom to look past our prejudices and truly see the people around us. As the applause finally began to die down, an elegant older gentleman stood up from his table near the window. His eyes were bright with recognition as he made his way toward the piano. Several other diners watched curiously. There was something about his bearing that commanded attention. "I knew I recognized those hands," he said warmly, approaching Lynn. 3 years ago, Carnegie Hall. You played Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Carnegie Hall? The whispers started spreading from table to table like wildfire. The other servers stopped their work, listening intently. The gentleman turned to address the room, his voice carrying clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just had the privilege of hearing one of the most promising pianists of her generation. I should know. I was the conductor for the New York Philharmonic the night she made her debut." More gasps filled the room. At his table, Mr. Brooks had gone completely pale, his earlier smugness replaced by a sickly look of realization. The quiet man with glasses was frantically searching something on his phone, his eyes growing wider by the second. "Here it is," he exclaimed, holding up his phone. "Look at this review from the New York Times. A revelation in classical music. Technical brilliance matched only by emotional depth, a rising star whose light cannot be dimmed." The woman in the red dress leaned over to look at the phone, then covered her mouth with her hand. "There are dozens of articles," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Performance reviews, interviews, she has 2 master's degrees from Juilliard." Lynn stood quietly by the piano, her hands clasped in front of her uniform. She hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't wanted her background to become public knowledge. But as she looked around the restaurant, she saw something in people's faces that wasn't just surprise, it was understanding. Chef Pierre had emerged from the kitchen, still wiping tears from his eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked softly, his French accent thick with emotion. Before Lynn could answer, Mrs. Thompson spoke up from her table. "Because she didn't need to," she said firmly. "Good work is good work, whether you're playing at Carnegie Hall or serving dinner at a restaurant." The older gentleman nodded in agreement. "But perhaps now is the time for the whole story," he suggested gently. "Sometimes sharing our truth helps others understand their own prejudices." Lynn took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of people she'd served and worked with for months. They deserve to know. My mother had a stroke last year, she began, her voice quiet but clear. She needed specialized care, and our insurance wouldn't cover all of it. Music had to wait. The restaurant was silent again, but this time with a different kind of attention. Even Mr. Brooks was listening, the arrogance gone from his posture. I chose to work here because I love being part of creating beautiful experiences for people, Lynn continued. Every perfectly served plate, every well-timed coffee refill, every smile. It's all part of the same dedication I give to music. No job is beneath anyone if you do it with pride and care. A young waitress who had started just last week was crying quietly. The host, Tony, stood straighter at his podium, his head held high. Around the room, diners were looking at their servers with new eyes, seeing not just people who brought their food, but individuals with their own stories, their own dreams, their own incredible deaths. The older gentleman smiled warmly. And now, thanks to a certain someone's rather misguided challenge, everyone here knows what I learned years ago, that greatness doesn't depend on titles or bank accounts. It lives in the heart and shows in how we treat others. Mr. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face red with shame. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated. One of his companions, the quiet man with glasses, was already pulling out his business card. I'm on the board of the City Arts Foundation, he said, standing up and walking toward Lynn. We've been looking for someone to lead our new community music program. It would involve teaching underprivileged children, organizing concerts, really making a difference. He paused, looking embarrassed to be part of Mr. Brooks's party. The salary would be substantial and the schedule flexible enough to care for your mother. Other diners were reaching for their business cards too. A woman in a blue dress called out that she worked for a healthcare foundation that might be able to help with medical costs. Another man mentioned a connection to a physical therapy center known for its innovative treatments. Lynn stood there, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of support and opportunities. She thought about her mother, about their dreams of opening a music school, about all the twists and turns life had taken to bring her to this moment. The restaurant had transformed into something more than just a dining room. It had become a place of revelation, of connection, of barriers breaking down between people who might never have truly seen each other otherwise. And through it all, the grand piano stood silent but proud, as if knowing it had played its part in changing not just one evening, but possibly many lives. The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges, but something fundamental had shifted in that room, something that no amount of money could buy and no social status could dictate. The rest of the evening at Le Petit Bistro flowed like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Lynn returned to her duties, serving tables with the same grace she had shown at the piano. But now, every interaction was different. Diners looked at her, at all the servers, with new respect, new understanding. Mr. Brooks's table had grown quiet, that earlier arrogance replaced by thoughtful silence. When it came time for their bill, Lynn approached with her usual professional demeanor. She placed the leather folder gently on the table, then turned to leave. "Wait," Mr. Brooks called out, his voice different now, softer, almost humble. He stood up, pulling out his wallet. "The $15,000. You more than earned it." Lynn turned back, her posture straight and dignified. "Keep it," she said quietly. "Instead, I hope you'll consider donating it to the restaurant's employee education fund. A lot of the staff here are working to pay for school." The quiet man with glasses was already writing a check for twice that amount, marking it specifically for the education fund. The woman in the red dress added her own contribution. Around the restaurant, other diners were doing the same, inspired by the moment. As the evening wound down, Lynn's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was your night, sweetheart?" She smiled, knowing she had so much to tell her. The City Arts Foundation board member had given her his card, promising to set up a meeting to discuss the community music program position. The Healthcare Foundation representative had already made some calls, finding a specialist who was pioneering new stroke recovery techniques. She'd insisted on paying for a consultation for Lynn's mother, saying, "Music helped my daughter through some tough times. It's my turn to give back." Chef Pierre emerged from the kitchen, carrying a special dessert he created on the spot. A delicate piano-shaped chocolate sculpture with musical notes drawn in gold leaf. "For your mother," he said with a warm smile. "And you must bring her here soon." My wife is a retired physical therapist. Perhaps she can help. The restaurant staff gathered for their usual end-of-shift meeting, but tonight was different. The manager announced that Mr. Lee, their regular pianist, had called again, this time to say he was retiring and wanted to recommend Lynn as his replacement if she was interested in playing one night a week while pursuing her other opportunities. Tony, the young host, shared that he'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone he was studying music theory in college. But now, he said, looking at Lynn with admiration, I'm proud to say it. Maybe you could give me some pointers sometime. Mrs. Thompson stayed until closing, helping to spread the word about Lynn's story to her extensive network of arts patrons. By the time she left, there were already plans forming for a benefit concert to help establish a scholarship fund for aspiring musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. As Lynn cleaned her last table for the night, she found a note tucked under a plate. It was from the young girl who had watched her performance so intently. Dear piano lady, I took one piano lesson but wanted to quit because it was hard. After watching you tonight, I'm going to keep trying. Thank you. 6 months later, the restaurant had transformed. A small plaque now hung near the piano, telling the story of that remarkable night. The Employee Education Fund had grown enough to help several staff members pursue their dreams. Lynn split her time between teaching at the community music program, performing occasional concerts and, yes, playing one night a week at Le Petit Bistro. Her mother's health had improved significantly with the new treatments. She often sat at her special table near the piano, beaming with pride as she watched her daughter play. The physical therapy was paying off. She could now walk with only minimal assistance, and her speech had returned almost completely. The music school Lynn had dreamed of was becoming a reality, with support from unexpected places. Former diners from that fateful night had become donors and board members. Even Mr. Brooks had changed. He now funded several full scholarships, though he insisted on remaining anonymous. On opening day of the music school, Lynn saw many familiar faces. The restaurant staff came in full force, Chef Pierre bringing a spectacular cake decorated with musical notes. Mrs. Thompson brought a group of potential donors. The young girl who had left the note was there with her family, eager to sign up for lessons. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Lynn's mother cut the ribbon to officially open the school. Her hands were steady as she held the scissors, and her voice was clear as she spoke the words they had chosen together. Welcome to a place where everyone's music matters. The school's first piano was the same one from Le Petit Bistro, donated by the restaurant's owner, who had bought a new one for the dining room. It stood proud in the main teaching room, its keys still holding the memories of that transformative night. As Lynn prepared to teach her first class, she thought about how life's hardest moments sometimes lead to its greatest blessings. She looked at the eager faces of her students, children who might never have had the chance to learn music otherwise, and knew that every step of her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. The restaurant still held special magic, especially on the nights when Lynn played. Servers worked with pride, knowing their own dreams were valid and worthy. Diners learned to look beyond appearances, to treat everyone with respect. And sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could still hear echoes of that first surprising performance, notes of courage, dignity, and the transformative power of being true to oneself.